Thank you very much for the introduction. She's much taller than me. So thank you so much. I think this is, by way of introduction, I must just say that, one of the things that we have demonstrated through this UNITAID grant is how that partnership between communities and implementers and funders can be such a big change. And I was just struck by that comment that came at last that, we're depending so much on one drug and so on. And as Francois said, we're not seeing resistance. It's just an issue of adherence. And this is where we're going to need communities to engage with national programs. And I hope we can take that forward. I hate slides, please. And I've asked somebody to help me advance them. So next slide. So what was the experience? I think we've had some of them. I think if you start looking at, say, clinical trials and look at DEFT was probably sort of a blueprint for what a really strong community advisory board should look like. They worked in multiple countries and came up with a strategy that was so representative and so strong, with a clear communication strategy between the protocol team and the country teams through the regional chairs. And so if you really, I think for me, if you're designing a clinical trial, this is what a community advisory board, a good community advisory board would look like. And I think when you look at some of the information that was generated through DEFT, right down cascading to communities, you can understand why. And I think that structure helped achieve that. Next slide. Next slide. I won't talk about NAMSAL because I think we heard enough about it. I think they focused a lot more on journalists and then brought in communities and engaged one community champion in the trial, and that seemed to have worked quite well. And then the next one I really also wanted to touch on, next slide, again, was Dauphin. Again, if you're thinking about putting together a community advisory board, what Dauphin also told us was the thought process in which you try and assess the best way to incorporate community advisory boards in your trial. Again, very well thought out, nice analysis. And if you look at the right bottom corner, you will see that there was the assessment showed that communities' engagement would have been was rated very high, and through their communication, and again, working with groups such as Treatment Action Campaign and the AIDS Community AIDS, the National Network of People Living with HIV in Uganda, proved very effective in the trial. Next slide. But what I really wanted to do was spend a little bit more time talking about the Optimal CAB, or the Clinton Health Access Initiative CAB, or CHI-CAB, because that's the one I was really involved with a little bit more. This was not a trial. This was an implementation plan that was put together or funded by UNITAID to roll out dolutegravir in Africa. Next slide. The CHI-CAB was, and I'll call it CHI-CAB, was established in 2017, right at the beginning of dolutegravir rollout. I think it was just about coming into the guidelines or just before the guidelines. And in 2017, there were something like just 11 countries at the beginning. And by next slide, by 2022, at the end of the grant, we had 30 people in 16 countries. So the CHI-CAB actually spoke all the major sort of 3 languages, Portuguese, French, and English, including local languages. Next slide. And what was so successful about it, that if you imagine that in 2017, there were only 6,000 people taking DTG in 3 countries. Next slide. By the end of the grant, to date, we have more than 20 million. And the community advisory board system helped, disseminate this information about DTG. I think if you remember some of your countries, the communities were the ones who were asking you, when are we going to get DTG? When are we going to get DTG? Even before you got it in the countries. And I believe that it was that deliberate engagement with communities that made a big difference. And I think a very good example of how to engage communities in product introduction. Next slide. And also, what also happened was, during that period, because of the technical capacities and capacity building, we had a lot of these CHICAB members, participate in international, national, and regional processes. You found that because of their technical capacity, they were incorporated in guidelines development, and they still do participate in guidelines processes. They were incorporated in the ECHO trial as, in the steering committee. They've been incorporated in technical working groups in some of your countries, in Malawi, and so on. And so you find that, again, it was not only just able to support and advocate for the adoption of dolutegravir, but it also created new champions and new technical capacities that did not exist on treatment in our countries. And you'll hear a little bit more about this from Lucky Boy, how this also was used through the advanced trial in South Africa. Next slide. Again, during that period, we also advocated for a rapid adoption of pediatric 10 milligrams DTG. And again, there we saw rapid uptake. If you compare that lopinavir, ritonavir, took 10 years to be adopted, widely adopted by countries. Next slide. You will see that with PDTG, literally only took a matter of months. I think by the 18th month, literally every country had adopted PDTG. And that again also saw, was a contribution of the CHICAB. Next slide. Since then, we've taken on other challenges. We've taken on, we believe that darunavir 400 milligrams, which has now been pre-qualified by WHO, is a strong regimen and really should replace lopinavir, ritonavir. And the reason why we think this is important, because people living with HIV on second line are probably the most stigmatized. They stigmatize themselves, we stigmatize them, look at them as failures, even by their fellow people living with HIV. And so they don't complain to you as clinicians. But when they talk to us and they complain about the diarrhea for getting that second dose in the evening because they're having a glass of whiskey somewhere, it's a big deal. And so we think that now that we got darunavir, we should really transition people to this much more robust and better tolerated drug. And we've also done the same thing with the long-acting. It's nice to see some of our friends from Viv Healthcare. You can ask them about our engagement with them to, again, make sure that we can get access to cabotegravir in Africa quickly. Lessons learned, I think the critical one for me is that, critical ones for me is this bi-directional learning that we've been able to have. CHI produced and provided technical capacities to us, and we were able then to help them and direct them and work with the governments in how to best deploy the various interventions and the ways we use information system, communication systems, and develop communication strategies, and so on. And so that was so critical. And the other important point, lesson, was that we were able to tailor responses according to country context. For instance, in Uganda, they felt that targeting community radios was going to be effective, and developing a tool that was available to healthcare workers was going to accelerate access. In Nigeria, they preferred to use counselors and peer educators, and so on. So you had all these different approaches, and because even if it was one intervention, the deployment and the way you could they could develop these interventions was country-specific. And the last one is sustainability. The knowledge that the CHICAB members have gained will remain in the countries. It will not go anywhere. But what is critical is that we are able to sustain them through funding. That I'm hoping that, through maybe Global Fund or PEPFAR funding or another, even, Ministry of Health funding, we're able to retain these groups of people to be able to continue to provide this technical, information that they've gained. If they don't, we will lose them. Next time we need to introduce a new drug, we'll have to start with a whole new group, and it can be a little bit more complicated than perhaps we've made it look in this in this grant. Final slide is just to acknowledge that UNITAID played a very critical role in really creating the space for communities. They made it as a condition that you cannot implement any of their grants unless you have community engagement. So we hope that other funders, national governments, can adopt this model in order to have ownership of our interventions by communities. Thank you very much.